The air in the room was thick enough to taste. Dust motes, ancient and gold, danced in the single shaft of late afternoon sun slanting through the window. Outside, the sounds of Ouagadougou, a city holding its breath. Inside, silence. A heavy, waiting silence. Then, the voice of an aide, sharp with a nervous energy that betrayed the sterile formality of his words. "Captain, the call is coming through. It is Charlize Theron." The name landed in the tense quiet like a stone dropped into a deep well. Charlize Theron. A name that belonged to another universe. A universe of flashing camera bulbs, red carpets, and acceptance speeches under glittering chandeliers. A world of carefully crafted activism, of hashtags and global campaigns, of a compassion broadcast from 30,000 feet. And here, in this room, smelling of sweat, steel, and the dry earth of the Sahel, sat the other universe. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A man whose world was defined by the grit under his fingernails, the weight of a nation's hope on his shoulders, and the ever-present threat of an unseen enemy in the bush. This wasn't just a phone call. It was a collision. A reckoning. The polished, air-conditioned world of Hollywood humanitarianism was about to make contact with the raw, unfiltered reality of a revolution. The world was watching. The pundits were ready. The headlines were pre-written. They thought they knew how this would go. A lecture on democracy. A scolding on human rights. An offer of aid, wrapped in conditions and condescension. They thought they knew him. They thought they knew her. They were wrong. About everything. What happened next wasn't a conversation. It was a quiet detonation. And her reaction, when she finally understood the man she was speaking to, was absolutely priceless. Before I reveal the one sentence he said that changed everything, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because you're not going to want to miss the lessons from this historic exchange. The phone on the desk felt less like a tool of communication and more like a portal. A tear in the fabric of reality. On one end, a man whose face was etched with the harsh sun and sleepless nights of a nation at war with itself. A man who wore the burden of his people like a second skin. His uniform wasn't a costume, it was a promise. His red beret wasn't an accessory, it was a symbol of sacrifice, soaked in the righteous anger of a continent tired of being a footnote in someone else's history book. He could feel the vibrations of the city through the concrete floor, the hum of generators, the distant cry of a market vendor, the nervous energy of soldiers at checkpoints. This was his reality. Tangible. Heavy. On the other end of that invisible line, a world spun from light and celluloid. A world where empathy was a performance and influence was a currency. Charlize Theron. An icon. A force of nature in her own right. A daughter of Africa, yes, but an Africa seen through the rearview mirror of a luxury SUV, an Africa of sprawling landscapes and photogenic suffering. Her intentions, no doubt, were noble. Her heart likely in the right place. But her world was one where problems could be solved with a gala, a campaign, a celebrity endorsement. She was about to speak to a man who knew problems were solved with blood, with soil, with the unbreakable will of a people who had decided, finally, to stand up. The static on the line was the sound of these two worlds grinding against each other. It was the sound of an impending paradigm shift. The aide held out the receiver. Traoré took it. His grip was steady. His eyes were calm. He was ready. He had been ready his entire life. He didn't see a movie star. When he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second before speaking, he saw the faces. The old woman in a village near Djibo, her hands gnarled like ancient roots, who had given him her last cup of water and said, "Do not forget us." The young boy, no older than 10, playing with a toy truck made of scrap wire in a displaced person's camp, his eyes holding a wisdom far beyond his years, a silent question in their depths. Will we ever go home? He saw the faces of his soldiers, young men who had traded their youth for a chance to reclaim their homeland, their laughter in the barracks hiding a deep-seated fear they would never admit. These were the people he answered to. Not the international community. Not the United Nations. Not a Hollywood actress. The faces. That was his constituency. That was his truth. The world expected a politician. A man who would speak in carefully chosen diplomatic language, who would deflect and deceive, who would play the game. They had forgotten that before he was a president, he was a soldier. And a soldier is trained in one thing above all else: the truth of the situation on the ground. The unvarnished, brutal, and often inconvenient reality. He was the interim leader of Burkina Faso, a title that felt both impossibly large and laughably inadequate to describe the task at hand. Leader of a nation on fire. Captain of a ship in a hurricane. He was 34 years old. In the West, a man his age might be worrying about a mortgage, a promotion, climbing a corporate ladder. He was worried about ammunition supplies, grain distribution, and the creeping shadow of extremism that threatened to swallow his country whole. He had come to power not through a thirst for it, but through a vacuum of it. He had watched as the previous government faltered, as foreign partners offered condolences but not solutions, as his people's hope curdled into despair. The coup was not an act of ambition, it was an act of desperation. A last-ditch effort to stop the bleeding. He had stood before his people, not in a tailored suit, but in his fatigues, and he had made them a promise. Not a promise of instant peace or prosperity, but a promise of dignity. A promise that Burkinabe would be the masters of their own destiny. That their land, their resources, their future belonged to them. It was a promise as old as Africa itself, a dream that had been deferred for generations. And now this call. A symbol of everything he was fighting against. The idea that salvation would come from the outside. That a famous face held more power than the collective will of 22 million people. He knew the narrative. The troubled African nation. The strongman leader. The humanitarian crisis. Words thrown around in newsrooms in London and New York, words that flattened the complexity of his world into a two-dimensional caricature. They saw a problem to be managed. He saw a home to be defended. On her end, Charlize Theron was likely sitting in a space of quiet, minimalist luxury. Her world was ordered, predictable. Her activism was a part of her brand, a commendable and sincere part, but a part nonetheless. Through her foundation, she had done good work, focusing on the youth of Southern Africa. She had raised awareness, she had raised money. She had spoken eloquently at forums and conferences about the challenges facing the continent. She understood, intellectually, the scope of the problems. Poverty, disease, instability. She had seen it, documented it, and campaigned against it. But there is a difference between seeing a problem from the outside and living it from the inside. A difference between diagnosing a wound and feeling the throb of it in your own flesh. Her framework was built on the premise of help, of intervention, of providing resources that were lacking. It was a noble framework, the dominant framework of the entire global aid industry. But it was a framework that, by its very nature, placed the helper in a position of power and the helped in a position of dependency. It was a relationship of benefactor and recipient. It was not a partnership of equals. This was the philosophical chasm that the crackling satellite signal had to bridge. A chasm of experience, of perspective, of power. A chasm that had been carved over centuries of colonial history and neo-colonial practice. The media, in their predictable frenzy, had already set the stage for a drama of their own making. Hollywood star to confront African coup leader. The headlines practically wrote themselves. They envisioned a morality play. The beautiful, conscientious actress, a global symbol of liberal values, speaking truth to power, challenging the uniformed strongman. They expected her to be the voice of reason, the conscience of the world. They expected him to be defensive, truculent, perhaps even dismissive. A clash of civilizations in miniature. Social media was a tinderbox of speculation. On one side, a chorus of approval for Theron. Use your platform. Speak for the voiceless. On the other, a torrent of suspicion and anger from Pan-African voices. Who is she to lecture him? Another white savior coming to tell us how to live. The digital world had drawn its battle lines before a single word had been exchanged. They had flattened both individuals into avatars for their own ideologies. She was the West. He was Africa. And in this simplistic, polarized view, there was no room for nuance, no room for humanity, no room for the possibility of a genuine connection. Traoré was aware of this noise. He was not naive. He knew how the world saw him, how it saw his country. A lost cause. A basket case. A problem. He felt the weight of that global gaze, the crushing condescension of it. But he also felt a deep, abiding faith in his people. He had seen their resilience, their courage, their ingenuity. He had seen a farmer with no formal education devise a brilliant irrigation system using nothing but gourds and bamboo. He had seen a woman with nothing to her name start a thriving business selling spiced nuts, her laughter a defiant song against the backdrop of hardship. He knew his people were not problems to be solved. They were solutions waiting to be unleashed. The world saw poverty. He saw potential. The world saw chaos. He saw a nation in the painful, messy process of being reborn. The formal greetings were exchanged. Her voice was as expected, clear, measured, professional. A voice accustomed to being heard. She began by expressing her deep concern for the humanitarian situation. She spoke of the displaced, the hungry, the vulnerable. She spoke of the work her foundation was doing in other parts of the continent. It was a perfect, polished, and predictable opening. It was filled with compassion, but it was the compassion of a surgeon looking at a patient on a table. There was a distance, an observational quality. She was outlining the problem as she saw it from her vantage point. He listened. He did not interrupt. He let her speak, let her lay out the entire framework of her worldview. He heard the sincerity in her voice. He did not doubt her intentions. But he also heard the unspoken assumptions. The language of crisis, of victimhood, of need. The narrative that he and his people were objects of pity, waiting for a savior. He let the silence hang for a moment when she finished. A silence that traveled thousands of miles across oceans and continents. A silence that made the sterile connection feel suddenly intimate. Then he spoke. And his voice was not what she expected. It was not the belligerent bark of a military man. It was not the slippery tongue of a politician. It was calm. It was quiet. It was heavy with a dignity that was unshakable. Madame Theron, he began, his French soft but firm. We appreciate your concern. The world's concern is noted. But I must be clear. Burkina Faso is not asking for charity. We are asking for respect. There was the first tremor. The first crack in the foundation of the old narrative. Not a rejection of her concern, but a reframing of the entire relationship. He continued, his words slow and deliberate, each one chosen with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. You speak of the humanitarian crisis. I speak of a crisis of sovereignty. The hunger you see is a symptom. The displacement you see is a symptom. The violence you see is a symptom. For decades, the world has been trying to treat the symptoms. They bring us sacks of grain, but they do not help us to grow our own. They send us peacekeeping forces, but they do not help us to build our own army. They give us aid, but they take our resources. This is not help. This is life support. And a man on life support is not a free man. On the other end of the line, there was only silence. This was not the conversation she had prepared for. Her talking points, her carefully researched statistics, her heartfelt appeals, they all suddenly seemed irrelevant. He was not arguing with her. He was changing the entire terrain of the argument. He was zooming out from the immediate, pixelated image of suffering to the vast, panoramic landscape of its cause. He was handing her a new map, and she was struggling to find her bearings. For too long, Traoré's voice continued, a quiet fire entering his tone. We have been told that our way is not the right way. That we need to import models of democracy, of economics, of society that do not fit our reality. We are told to hold elections, but what is the meaning of a vote to a man whose child is starving? What is the freedom of speech to a woman who is afraid to leave her home because of terrorists? We have been taught to look for answers from the outside. My goal, Madame Theron, is to teach my people to look for the answers from within. He paused, and in that pause, he let the full weight of his philosophy settle. It was a philosophy of radical self-reliance. A declaration of independence not just from a colonial power, but from a colonial mindset. The mindset that Africa was a project to be managed by the West. You have a foundation, he said, his tone softening slightly, shifting from teacher to collaborator. You want to help the youth? I applaud this. But let me tell you what our youth need. They do not need handouts that create a culture of dependency. They need tools. They need education that is relevant to their lives, not a curriculum designed in Paris or London. They need technology to process our own cotton, our own gold, our own manganese. They need investment in their ideas, not sympathy for their plight. This was the core of it. The paradigm-shattering truth. He was not rejecting her help. He was redefining it. He was challenging her to move beyond the comfortable, simplistic model of charity and to engage in the far more complex, far more difficult, but far more meaningful work of empowerment. He was asking her not to be a savior, but to be a partner. An equal partner. And then he delivered the sentence. The one that would echo in the silence long after the call was over. It was simple. It was profound. It was the distillation of his entire revolution into a handful of words. Madame Theron, he said, his voice imbued with a quiet, unshakable certainty. Do not come here to help us. Come here to build with us. Build with us. Not for us. Not on top of us. With us. The word hung in the air. It was an invitation. It was a challenge. It was a plea. It was a demand. It was the entire history of a continent's struggle, its hopes, its dreams, encapsulated in 3 syllables. It was a word that dismantled the hierarchy of giver and receiver. It was a word that laid a new foundation for a relationship based on mutual respect and shared creation. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of surprise. It was the silence of contemplation, of reevaluation, the sound of old certainties crumbling, the sound of a worldview being taken apart, piece by piece, and examined in a new light. He had not raised his voice. He had not used a single word of anger or accusation. He had simply spoken his truth, a truth so clear, so powerful, and so self-evident that it could not be ignored. He had treated her not as an adversary, but as someone capable of understanding. He had paid her the ultimate respect. He had assumed she was willing to learn. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. The polished, professional veneer was gone. There was a new hesitancy, a new softness, a humility. Captain, she said, and the word itself sounded different now, less like a formal title and more like a mark of earned respect. Tell me more. Tell me, what does that look like? To build with you. That was it. That was the priceless reaction. Not a gasp. Not an argument. Not a tearful confession. It was a question. A genuine, open-ended question. It was the moment she stopped talking and started listening. It was the moment she set aside her script and opened herself up to a new one. It was the moment the Hollywood icon, the global activist, became a student. In that moment, Traoré had achieved more than he could have in 100 speeches at the UN. He had not won an argument. He had opened a mind. He had planted a seed. And that, he knew, was how you truly change the world. Not with bombs or with broadcasts, but with a conversation. With a quiet, dignified, and revolutionary invitation, build with us. If you believe in the power of dignity and self-determination, if this message is hitting you right in the heart, type dignity in the comments below. Let's show the world this idea matters. And stick with me because the most powerful part, the aftermath of this call and what it means for all of us, is yet to come. The rest of the conversation flowed from that new foundation. It was no longer a confrontation, but a collaboration. A brainstorming session between 2 people from vastly different worlds, now standing on common ground. He spoke of specifics. He talked about the need for small-scale, decentralized agricultural processing plants so that farmers could sell finished products, not just raw materials. He talked about creating coding academies in local languages to unleash the technological creativity of Burkinabe youth. He talked about a new kind of tourism, one based on cultural exchange, not just safaris and sightseeing, where visitors would learn from the community, not just observe it. He painted a picture, not of a country in crisis, but of a country brimming with untapped potential. He was not asking her for money. He was asking for connections, for expertise, for partners who were willing to come and share their knowledge, not as superiors, but as equals. He was asking her to use her immense platform not just to show the world pictures of suffering, but to show the world pictures of innovation, of resilience, of creation. Show them our engineers, he said. Show them our artists. Show them our entrepreneurs. The world knows the story of Africa's poverty. It is time they learn the story of Africa's genius. He spoke with a passion that was infectious, a clarity that was undeniable. He was no longer just a soldier or a president. He was a visionary, a nation builder. He was articulating a new path forward, not just for Burkina Faso, but for any nation that had felt the sting of condescension and the heavy weight of low expectations. It was a message of profound optimism, an optimism forged not in ignorance of the problems, but in a deep and abiding faith in the people's ability to solve them. On her end, Charlize Theron was doing something that perhaps she hadn't done in a long time in a professional context. She was truly listening. She was absorbing. The world of Hollywood is a world of talking, of pitching, of selling oneself. It is a world of monologues. She had entered this call expecting to deliver one. Instead, she was receiving one of the most powerful and transformative lessons of her life. She could feel the tectonic plates of her own understanding shifting. The categories she had used to organize the world, developed and developing, donor and recipient, helper and helped, were dissolving. They were being replaced by a more fluid, more complex, and infinitely more hopeful understanding of human potential. The call eventually ended. The formal goodbyes were said, but the connection was not severed. Something had been forged in that hour across the satellite waves. A bridge. A fragile but essential bridge of understanding. Traoré placed the receiver back on its cradle. The silence returned to the room, but it was a different kind of silence now. The tension was gone. In its place was a sense of profound calm. A quiet vindication. He had not sought the world's approval, but in that moment, he had earned its respect, one person at a time. He looked out the window at the city of Ouagadougou, his city, his people. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows. The work was not finished. The struggle was far from over. But today, a small victory had been won. A victory for dignity. In the days and weeks that followed, the world's media, which had been so eager to report on a confrontation, had little to say. There was no explosive soundbite, no dramatic falling out. The story, as they had framed it, had failed to materialize. So they moved on, to the next crisis, the next headline. They had missed the real story. The real story was not in what was said publicly, but in what had shifted privately. The Priceless reaction was not a single moment, but a process. It was a change that began with that humble question, "Tell me more." It likely continued in private conversations with her advisors and the board of her foundation. It would be a shift from a mission of saving to a mission of serving. From providing to partnering. It would be a recognition that the most valuable thing she could offer was not her money or her fame, but her platform as a loudspeaker for the voices that had been ignored for so long. To show the world the engineers, the artists, the entrepreneurs that Traoré had spoken of. The pricelessness was in the dawning realization that her power was not in speaking for the voiceless, but in passing them the microphone. It was the humbling, liberating understanding that true help is not about making yourself the hero of someone else's story. It is about helping them to become the hero of their own. This is a lesson the world is still struggling to learn. Governments, NGOs, and well-meaning individuals across the globe are still trapped in the old paradigm of charity, the top-down model that so often perpetuates the very dependency it claims to alleviate. Ibrahim Traoré, in that one phone call, provided a masterclass in how to break that cycle. He did it not with anger, but with an unshakable sense of self-worth. He did it not by demanding, but by inviting. He affirmed his nation's dignity so completely that he forced the person on the other end of the line to see it too. He was calm, but assertive. He was respectful, but uncompromising on his core principles. He didn't tear down the old bridge. He simply built a new, better one alongside it and invited her to cross. This story is more than just an anecdote about a phone call. It is a parable for our times. It is about the shifting balance of power in the world. It is about the rise of a new generation of leaders who refuse to be defined by the narratives of the past. Leaders who are not asking for a seat at the old table, but are building a new one. It is a story about identity. The identity of a man, the identity of a nation, the identity of a continent. An identity that is not based on victimhood or grievance, but on strength, resilience, and an infinite capacity for creation. It's a story that challenges every single one of us. How do we engage with those who are different from us? Do we approach them with a script, with our own preconceived notions of who they are and what they need? Or do we approach them with the humility of a student, with a genuine desire to understand their world from their perspective? Do we see problems to be solved, or do we see potential to be unlocked? Do we offer a handout, or do we offer a hand in partnership? The core message is a powerful one. Dignity is not a gift to be given. It is an inherent right to be recognized. Traoré's genius was in his understanding of this fundamental truth. He knew that the material poverty of his nation was secondary to the poverty of dignity it had been forced to endure. And he knew that by restoring the latter, he could unleash the power of his people to solve the former. He was not just fighting terrorists in the bush, he was fighting a far more insidious enemy, the poverty of ambition, the learned helplessness that comes from being told for centuries that you are not good enough. His vision is a radical one. It suggests that the vast, multi-billion-dollar aid industry may be, in some ways, part of the problem. That by focusing on symptoms, it allows the world to ignore the root causes of inequality. That by providing endless streams of aid, it can stifle the development of local economies and create a permanent state of dependency. This is not to say that humanitarian aid is never necessary. In a crisis, it is vital. But it must be a temporary measure, a stepping stone to self-sufficiency, not a permanent crutch. The path Traoré is charting for his nation is a difficult one. It is a path of sacrifice, of hard work, of looking inward rather than outward. There will be setbacks. There will be failures. There are no guarantees of success. But it is a path of honor. It is a path of self-respect. It is a path that offers not the promise of an easy life, but the promise of a meaningful one. The promise of building something that lasts. Something that belongs to you. And perhaps, this is the ultimate lesson of the story. That the most powerful force for change in the world is not money, not power, not fame. It is a single, simple, revolutionary idea. The idea that you are the master of your own fate. That your future is not something to be received, but something to be built. It is an idea that can topple empires, inspire revolutions, and turn a simple phone call into a moment of profound and priceless transformation. This story, this quiet confrontation of worldviews, is a microcosm of a larger global awakening. All across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, a new consciousness is dawning. It's a rejection of the post-colonial order, a refusal to continue playing a role in a script written by someone else. It is a demand for a new narrative. A narrative where every nation, regardless of its wealth or military might, is treated as a sovereign equal. A narrative where partnership replaces patronage. A narrative built not on the shifting sands of charity, but on the solid rock of mutual respect. Think about the symbolism. The dusty office versus the polished world of celebrity. It's a visual representation of the abstract concepts at play. One is grounded, real, tangible. The other is an image, a broadcast, a performance. Traoré's power came from his authenticity. He was not performing leadership, he was living it. He was not reciting a philosophy, he was embodying it. This is why his words had such an impact. They were not just words, they were backed by the full force of his conviction and the lived experience of his people. Charlize Theron, in this narrative, represents the best of the old paradigm. She is not a villain. She is the well-intentioned, compassionate face of a system that is fundamentally flawed. Her priceless reaction, her transformation from speaker to listener, is a symbol of hope. It suggests that the old world is capable of learning, that it is capable of changing. It suggests that the bridge between these two universes can be built, if people are willing to be humble, to listen, and to question their own most deeply held assumptions. It requires a kind of moral courage that is often harder to find than physical courage. The courage to admit that you might not have all the answers. The courage to set aside your ego and truly hear the perspective of another. This is the challenge Traoré issued, not just to a movie star, but to the entire world. And it's a challenge that resonates far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. It speaks to marginalized communities everywhere. It speaks to anyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or underestimated. It is a powerful reminder that your circumstances do not define your worth. Your dignity is inherent. Your voice matters. The final, powerful truth of this encounter is about the nature of influence. Charlize Theron has millions of social media followers, a global platform, immense wealth, and access to the highest corridors of power. By all conventional measures, she was the powerful one in that conversation. Ibrahim Traoré is the leader of a poor, landlocked country, embroiled in conflict and diplomatically isolated. By all conventional measures, he was the weaker one. But in that exchange, the traditional dynamics of power were inverted. Real power, he demonstrated, does not come from external validation. It comes from an internal source. It comes from clarity of purpose. It comes from a deep connection to your roots, your people, your truth. It comes from an integrity that cannot be bought or sold. Traoré, armed with nothing but his dignity and his vision, was the more powerful person in that conversation. Because he was fighting for an idea that was bigger than himself. And he was so certain of the righteousness of that idea that he was able to transfer that certainty to the person on the other end of the line. That is the ultimate source of his power and the lesson for all of us. Find your truth. Know what you stand for. Connect with something larger than your own self-interest. And then speak that truth, not with anger or arrogance, but with the quiet, unshakable calm of someone who knows they are standing on solid ground. If you do that, you will be amazed at the minds you can open, the bridges you can build, and the priceless reactions you can inspire. The world is changed not by the loud, but by the clear. This story isn't just about two people. It's about a new future. It's about writing a new story for the 21st century. If you want to be part of a community that explores these powerful, world-changing ideas, a community that believes in dignity and partnership over charity and dependency, then your journey doesn't end here. Subscribe now and click the bell so you never miss a story that matters. Join us and find your voice in this new narrative. Become an insider in the movement for a more just and respectful world. The conversation is just beginning. Let's build it together.